And Nick, I think you have the first question for us to look at. You say you've been wondering about the similarities between the state of awareness characterized by the mind at stage 10 and the mind which is unsurpassable, and Nibbana. You mentioned that you've just been on a retreat where this theme was touched on. The teacher discussed the different schools of thoughts, splitting them clearly between those who believe that there is just consciousness and those who believe there is something out of which consciousness arises. You say your sense was that it was the latter of these two schools of thought that could entertain the possibility of gradual awakening without an experience of cessation and nibbana, um, because in some way what was achieved through the gradual cultivation of a stage 10 mind, you have a question mark there. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, sorry, I'm reading it back and it's not as clear as I thought it was when I first wrote it. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, but you're, you've been finding it hard to reconcile your own experience of crossing what feels into what feels like the territory of stream entry and not experiencing cessation. And in TMI, I said that cessation is not at all necessary. You're wondering why it is given so much emphasis in other traditions. It feels like this experience might be a time trap, but I don't want to be nonchalant and disregard an experience. So that's a wise choice there, to want to make sure you're not discounting something of great significance. So just to, let's just start with the first part of your question. And first of all, I think it's worthwhile to deconstruct a bit the term nibbana, uh, nibbana or nirvana, and then compare it with the state of stage 10 samatha. And then we can move on to discussing whether or not there is more than just consciousness, and the relationship between that and other things, with the experience of whether or not you experience cessation as a part of stream entry and other path attainments. So, first of all, nirvana or nibbana, it refers to the extinguishing of something, like the extinguishing of a candle. And so there is something that was present before that is no longer present. Now, if we disregard what was said in later Buddhism and just refer to what we find in the suttas, which we have to keep in mind there, the suttas weren't written down for 500 years in Pali, and then they weren't written again in Sanskrit until about 600 years later. However, many of the suttas were written down in Chinese before that, and so we have that as the agamas. Anyway, what we find looking at the suttas and the way the Buddha used the term nibbana, which is a kind of cessation, but a cessation of what? And the other term that's relevant here is nirodha, which is also a term that has a slightly different flavor to it, that is referring to a cessation. So the Buddha mentions nirvana in a number of different contexts. there is the cessation is the cessation experience that such a big deal is made about. What is it a cessation of? It's a cessation of mental formations, right? So consciousness becomes blank. And this is going to bear on the next aspect of this. Consciousness becomes blank. That constitutes that kind of cessation. Uh, but the Buddha refers to nirvana as being the cessation of craving, which also is the cessation of suffering. Then he refers to cessation as, or nibbana as the cessation of ignorance. And of course, these are all closely related. There's a later distinction made. I don't know if it ever appears in early Buddhist writings. I've never gotten around to looking, but much is made of it in the Mahayana, of two kinds of nirvanas, a nirvana with remainder and a nirvana without remainder. Now, in the same way that we looked at nirvana in terms of what ceases during that nirvana, what is extinguished, whether it's craving and suffering, ignorance, or altogether a temporary cessation of mental formations. Let's look at what's left as opposed to what's not left in the nirvana with remainder and the nirvana without remainder. Well, the easiest way to start with that is there are two kinds of nirvana with no remainder. One is the parinirvana at the death of the body, right? So, yeah, there's no remainder, all gone. The other is the Nirodha Samapatti. Now, I know in pragmatic Buddhism, they've made this into something much more simplistic than what's described. This is described as a state in which there is a cessation of feeling and perception. Now, cessation of perception occurs in deep sleep, coma, and things like that. The connotations of a cessation of feeling and perception are something much more profound. And it's put in the same category as the parinirvana of death. Now that tells us a lot, especially when we look at the description of Nirodha Samapatti. Typically, the practitioner enters this Nirodha will remain there for an extended period of time. The 7 days is the number that's given. Now, anytime the number 7 is used, what it means is not a tremendous number, but not a small number anyway. So it could be 3 days or 5 days or 14 days or 30 days or something like that. Now, the other thing that's said about it is that the body appears as if it were the corpse of someone who had died. So the only difference is a very subtle remaining heat. So what this corresponds to in other traditions, there is something that Indian yogis do and have been, this has been carefully investigated. They go into a state essentially of suspended animation. They've been buried in the ground for a week at a time, with no source of air or anything like this. And then they can come out of that and they're alive and healthy. So these are the two nibbanas without remainder. Death and the body going into extremely deep stasis. And apparently this is very, very rare. There is a description of this in the suttas, it's kind of an amusing anecdote. It's sort of it's almost uh, you know, I'm better than you, or my guru is better than your guru. Talking about, there's a sutta that talks about um, somebody going into this kind of Naroda Samapati, and um, I don't remember what's happening on it. A battle takes place or something around them, and it doesn't bring them out of it. And the Buddha apparently went into one where something similar happened. I don't remember the details of the story, but it is there in the suttas. It is preserved. So, without remainder is a pretty dramatic nirvana. What is the remainder in these nirvanas with remainder? The cessation experience is a nirvana with remainder, because the body remains alive. It usually doesn't last very long. It's just a period where um, essentially all conscious processes cease. Okay. Um, the more important nirvanas are those nirvanas of the, or nibbanas of the cessation of craving and suffering and ignorance. These are by far the most important nirvanas. Okay. Now, these nibbanas are associated with, um, well, ultimately, it's with the fourth path and the attainment of arhatship that ignorance is completely overcome, that even the subtlest forms of craving are overcome, and then likewise the subtlest forms of suffering are overcome, right? You're familiar with that. The characteristics of the five fetters that fall away with the completion of third path. And all right, so with the completion of second path, there is a falling away of all craving for things of the sense realm, and of the all of the suffering that's associated, the kind of gross suffering that's associated with that, leaving only the subtle existential suffering that's overcome in third path. The stage 10 samatha is something that uh, somebody can achieve prior to having reached third or fourth path in the path of samatha. Now, in the event that somebody achieves stage 10 samatha and had somehow done so without achieving stream entry already, or even second path already, if not beyond, in the event that they did, they would very quickly achieve stream entry and begin their progression through the paths. But as one moves through the paths, and certainly by the time one reaches third path, uh, the state characterized by the description of samatha becomes the norm, right? So that's the relationship between the two. That there are that it is possible to achieve stage 10 samatha when not on the cushion, to actually dwell in this state of samatha and function in the world without having achieved the path. But this comes naturally with the nirvanas of the cessation of craving, suffering, and ignorance to the degrees defined by third and fourth path, and becomes a much more common experience, much more easily sustained with first and second path practitioner, right? So does that clarify that aspect of things?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, right. Now, as for the school of thought that um, says that there is nothing but consciousness, um, I think I'm surprised that anyone in this point in history could possibly be able to sustain that. Um, it is so clearly obvious that consciousness is something that arises out of something else. And of course, as you see in uh, my analysis of it, based on many, many things I've read and studied, and consistent with my own personal experience, is that consciousness is what we call consciousness is something that it is a universal phenomenon of information exchange, but it is in itself a rather limited aspect of the totality of what is. And this is an experience that anybody has in meditation. Where do these thoughts arise in consciousness from? They come from somewhere. And when you reach a metacognitive state of metacognitive awareness, you see that even what you have thought was extrospective, a sensory input, you see once again, that's something that's arising in consciousness from somewhere else, from something that's outside of the field of consciousness. So that's not particularly sustainable. Now, what is more sustainable and has been a popular view at certain points in the philosophical history of the West, as well as in Buddhism, is that the only thing there is mind. But for this to be acceptable, we must make a distinction between the individual. Well, first of all, we must make a distinction between consciousness and mind that is not conscious, or as we would do in modern terms, consciousness and what is unconscious. Now, idealism is the technical term. Uh, Idealistic monism. You take the Cartesian dualism of mind and body as two separate things, and you reduce everything to mind. And so matter just becomes matter in the physical world is something created by mind to explain its own experiences. Now, that is actually valid, but it also falls down at a certain point. The same thing happens with materialistic monism. There is only matter, and mind is something that emerges from matter. That falls down at a certain point as well. And the only really tenable view that I found is that of a non-dualism of mind and matter. There is only one stuff that constitutes ultimate reality or ultimate truth, and that one stuff can appear as physicality, or it can appear as mind, as mentality, right? You could even say, when you look at it from the outside, it looks like matter and energy, physicality. Experienced from the inside, it is mind. And even in the mind-only schools, though, you have to posit something beyond the individual mind, something beyond consciousness, because there has to be something that the individual mind is that is the source of the input to the individual mind, and that places constraints on the individual mind. If we go to dreaming, in a dream, we might do impossible things, including uh, leap off the top of a building and fly. If we try to do that in the waking state of consciousness, there's certain results that are going to happen. So there is some kind of constraint. In other words, one way of defining the state of wakefulness from dreaming, the mind is creating both realities, but in the state of wakefulness, the senses are constrained by laws outside of them. In the case of leaping off of a roof to try to find it to fly, there's the law of gravity, right? Things like that. Okay, so is this all working for you, for all of you? Okay, good. So if we so what I'm offering you in place of a simple answer to your question about these two schools and things like that is essentially my view that that historically the physical monism and mind only or idealistic monism have worked up to a degree, but what I find is the fourth option of non-dualism works best in terms of these things. And certainly a consciousness only view is completely untenable, and it's inconsistent with the kind of reflective experience that we have in meditation. Okay. So I just kind of leave it at that. Now let's get to the role of the cessation experience. This cessation of mental formations, it is not necessary, but it is one way that can be a manifestation. Let's take in the case of stream entry. And the same thing will apply to each of the other path transitions that follow, okay? Insight has, or the insight in the singular, which is actually the multiple insights I described in the introduction and what is typically described in the Theravada as the tilakkhana, the three characteristics. When insights into these things reach a certain level of maturity, then there comes about the profound shift in perspective, the profound shift in perception that becomes the new norm for the person. The cessation experience is one of the ways that transition can happen, that shift in perception. But it is only one. It can happen more gradually, or it can happen as a kind of cessation that the person is just simply unaware of. Depending upon the type of practice one is doing, it can be recalled afterwards as just somehow an interruption in the flow of consciousness, and that's the cessation experience that so much has been made of. But the other way it can manifest, and quite a bit has been made of this as well, is an experience of pure consciousness, or consciousness by, well, what they mean by that, consciousness without an object. And which of these forms it will take will depend on the kind of meditation that you're actually practicing at the time. The essential thing about this is that there, in the last moment before either of these forms of cessation, pure consciousness or just a cessation experience, all of the different parts of the mind have now, I shouldn't say all, a significant number of the parts of the mind have reached the point of really recognizing the truth of these insights that have been developing and maturing. In the last moment before the cessation, something arises and it's seen purely from in consciousness. There is that final mental formation that arises, and it is recognized by these different parts of the mind from the perspective of insight. It's seen as it really is. And in that moment, the mind, instead of reflexively responding to that moment of consciousness with some next moment of consciousness arising out of some sort of clinging, it doesn't do that. And so there is one of these two kinds of cessations that occurs. And when the person comes out of it, they now have entered into this new state of perception. So it's an event that can happen as a part of that transition, but it's not necessary that it happen as part of that transition. An awful lot has been made of this in later Buddhism. You don't really find any mention of it in the suttas. Rather, most of the descriptions of people achieving stream entry or even higher paths in the suttas occur without that cessation. There's a description of someone who's fanning the Buddha as they're listening to what he says. And he says just the right thing. And all of a sudden, everything falls into place and they awaken. There's no mention of cessation of any kind. Even if we look at the stories of how Sariputta and Moggallana became followers of the Buddha. Sariputta encountered one of the 5 companions of the Buddha who he gave his first teaching to. And Sariputta and Moggallana, they had grown up together. They had been spiritual seekers together in a variety of traditions. They'd been working at this for a long time. A similar thing happened when Sariputta saw this person. He said, he noted that there was something different about this person. He says, please, sir, tell me who your teacher is and what he teaches. And he responded, he teaches the arising of all phenomena from causes and conditions and the passing away of all phenomena through causes and conditions. And this was the key that had the same effect. All of a sudden, all of the things that Sariputta had learned from his previous practice and previous teachers came together. And he realized, he had stream entry. So he went and found Moggallana and he recounted the story, and Moggallana had the same experience. So they decided to go and find this Buddha. And they end up taking a lot of their teacher's students with them, which he didn't like. That's a different part of the story, But anyway, you get what I'm after here. So where the cessation really becomes clear is in about I think it's 7th or 8th century A.D. when the Visuddhimagga was composed. And not too long prior to that was the Vimuttimagga. So the Visuddhimagga and the Vimuttimagga include descriptions of this cessation. Modern Theravada Buddhism is actually more strongly rooted in the Visuddhimagga than it is in the suttas, interestingly enough. So there's an interesting transition there. And so I think we can understand why so much emphasis is put on this. It's also the kind of dramatic event that most people, when they enter into some kind of spiritual path, are looking for. They want this lightning bolt out of the sky that suddenly brings them into this state of awakening and omniscience and all that kind of thing. It's a bit of a fairy tale. It's a very attractive fairy tale. And so they can take something that really does happen and it kind of fits into this pretty well. So I think that's where it all comes from. Um, so I would say, you say uh, you feel as though you've crossed into the territory of stream entry and there's been no cessation. And my response to that is, hey, don't worry about it. What is important is, have you undergone a permanent and lasting transition where the criteria that the Buddha laid out, that those first three fetters have truly fallen away? If that is your lived experience, if you have undergone a perceptual shift so that that describes how you see yourself and the world going forward, then you are in stream entry. Whether or not you had a cessation and just don't remember it, whether or not you never had a cessation, it doesn't matter. Don't waste your time on it. It is the effects. As I have been known to say, cessation is an experience, and experiences don't mean shit. It's the lasting transformations that mean something, not experiences.
Thank you so much, Culadasa. I really appreciate that. Your answers, yeah, so helpful. And to be honest, like I have been feeling like so much confidence in the fact that it had happened. Which replaced what had previously been a whole load of doubt. That I felt so good about it and positive about it, but just I really wanted to affirm, with someone a confusion that I had. And yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to do so. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. You're very welcome. All right. Uh, is Nicole here with us? Yes? Are you Nicole? No. Okay, if Nicole is not here, then let's go to Gunnar's question, and we can come back to Nicole's question afterwards. Maybe she'll arrive, and if she doesn't, we'll go on anyway. So Gunnar, you say, how common is it to be at stage 9? Well, that's an odd kind of question to answer, but let's get to what you're really after here. I've been meditating on and off for 10 years now, but I've been with TMI for only the last few years. As sittings go by, I'm more and more convinced I'm actually at such an advanced level. It's quite literally unbelievable to me. The experiences you describe in TMI match mine to the extent that I can recognize them, but somehow I expected more. I guess I'm just not perceiving the day-to-day gradual growth I'm having, and that most insights come now at stages 9 and 10. And you asked me to comment on that. Okay. So, Gunnar, if what your experience is in practice is that corresponds to the description of stage 9, then certainly if you are not completely in stage 9 in the sense that I have defined it, you're obviously very close to it, and you're moving into it and out of it, right? I think some of the latter parts of your question, if I recall, yeah, you say euphoria is creeping in and destabilizing my mind. So I expand my attention to merge with it, to merge it with awareness, and that works. Energies levels drop to a more sensible level, and I can hold this state much longer. Well, what you're talking about right there sounds exactly to me like what happens when you're, with with all of these stages, you tend to be working back and forth between 2 or 3 of them at any given time. So it sounds like really you're working back and forth between stages 8 and 9. The PT reaches an intensity of euphoria, and this can bring you back down again, right? Yeah. And so now what you've found is that by sounds like you're practicing the techniques of the meditation on the mind, where you tend to you just merge your attention with awareness, and you find that can stabilize this passaddhi, or tranquility, that is what stage 9 is all about. So yeah, that's a very good way to do it. Now, you don't want it to be the only way you do it. You want to, what you're looking for is this place where when the intensity of the PT reaches a peak, that it spontaneously transforms into this very energetic, but very tranquil and very blissful state of extreme clarity. So achieving that the way you are is really good. But also see if you can just allow the mind system to train itself to achieve that spontaneously. Then you can still do that meditation on the mind intentionally, but starting from a stable state. And what you'll find there, the one difference, what you're experiencing now, if I recall, I'll go back and read the rest of that. But sometimes I feel what I can only describe as a very subtle dullness creeping in. At this point, I've been moving my attention back to the breath, which re-energizes me, so to say. And this becomes a cycle. That's actually not a bad cycle. I guess the only question, what I should ask is, are you finding that you need to do this less and less often?
Not sure. It's all quite recent.
Okay. Oh, okay. That's great. Well, keep it up. But what you want to watch out for is getting stuck in a pattern where the mind has found a way to perpetuate a particular mental state, but it hasn't quite found the way to make that stable in a more naturally stable way. If that's the case, then, if you reach a point where, well, gee, this has been going on for months now, and it's really not getting any better, then it's time to take some different approaches, and we could talk about that another time. But if this is fairly new, yeah, then go ahead. And if this is all you need to do, then what you're going to find is that state remains more stable. You don't necessarily need to be in the state of merging of awareness. And although I will say a certain degree of that merging of attention and awareness is going to happen in stage 9 regardless. I mean, it's really easy to enter into this Mahamudra state in stage 9. So I'm not trying to say, avoid it, but you can maintain more of a separation between attention and awareness, and allow the two acting as different mental functions in an optimal way is really conducive to insight, because they provide the mind with two different perspectives that the perspectives can be assimilated. Now, the value of Mahamudra is it merges the two functions together, and that helps to give rise to the same thing. But as with all of these things, when you're training a complex system like the mind, you want to train to achieve the same things in a variety of different ways. In other words, you want to train it in, I shouldn't use the word you in this, but I will, because, it's really the mind system training itself. But I think you know what I mean, is you want the mind system to develop multiple pathways leading to the same optimal, stable state, right?
So that would be to, in a way, write it out so that
Yeah,
use
right.
area, but I get to keep the intention with keeping attention on the breath.
That's right. Yeah. Yes. Yes. In whatever ways that seem appropriate, and at this stage in your practice, you can pretty much trust your own intuition, because if you're on a non-productive path, you will intuit that as well. So, but bring that piety to a peak and look for this natural transition into the passaddhi state, the tranquility, where the full energy of PT and the bliss of PT is still present, but without this too energetic quality that brings you back down again, and also without where you don't fall away into a state of dullness. Got it? All right.
And that dullness is something that you've seen before. It's like I'm using too much energy, so it's really literally.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. I suppose in physiological terms, until the difference between an easily sustained state is considerable rewiring has taken place in the brain. A more temporary state involves an overactivity of certain pathways involving certain neurotransmitters, and they're going to get exhausted. And once they get exhausted, poof. Yeah. So that's what this training is. This is for your brain actually to structurally change to make this much more accessible and much more permanent. All right. The strong energy currents that you're feeling, you're describing them as arising from your genital area, and that's actually very, very normal. And if you look at the chakras, and in some of the yogic practices that work directly with the chakras, and likewise with the Tibetan tantric practices, they make use of the energy and these particular points. Now, the abdomen is an extremely powerful energy source that has a particular flavor to it. The two lower chakras are each even more powerful, but they have a different flavor to the kind of energy that they generate. So this is normal and it's valuable. Since you are experiencing it, you may want to look into some of those yogic practices or some of those Tibetan practices. In the Tibetan practices, they're referred to as winds and drops rather than as energy currents, and nadis. Nadis refer to the energy pathways, and chakras refer to these energy centers. So, but these are, well, you also find the same thing in qi. So if you get into any of the Chinese or other Asian disciplines which speak of using the chi energy and the flow of energy and things like that. That can be a useful adjunct as well. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. By the way, anybody that wants to ask a further question or comment on something I say here, please feel free to, okay? All right, Pasquale. In TMI, you say that stressful life circumstances can bring even the most advanced meditator back to the early stages. Can you expand on this? It is my understanding that those who experience insight and awakening never fall back. Are you referring instead to the development of samatha? Well, in this case, in this particular case, when I'm talking about the stages of samatha vipassana, I am referring specifically to the development of samatha, but everything I say also applies to insight and the path attainments as well. So let me expand on that, okay? Actually, where did Pasquale go? Oh, there you are. It's just your name disappeared. Yeah, your name disappeared. Yeah, great. Okay, so actually one of the things that I always expand upon when what's in TMI, when I'm guiding people in meditation practices or doing teachings or things like that, is to explain this constant phenomenon. Now I do try to normalize it early in the book when I give that little diagram that in the course of a single sit or over a series of sit, you find yourself moving back and forth between many different stages. And often you're practicing at a higher stage and all of a sudden you find yourself at a lower stage. And one of the things that this can correlate with is stressful life circumstances. But it can happen even when you're not particularly aware that of the circumstances that are producing that shift. And sometimes the circumstances aren't external, they're internal. But I try to normalize it there, but I don't, I mean, you probably would have never read my book if I had expanded on all of these points in the book, because it's already a long book. These apparent falling backs are not a bad thing. They're not a negative thing. They're an extremely good thing. They're a positive thing. They are an absolutely necessary thing. The mind system is huge. It has many parts to it. And as you train it, that training has to expand both horizontally and vertically. If you think of this, let's think of this hierarchy as being, there's these levels of the major subminds that are each of them consisting of many subminds, each of those as many subminds, and so forth. Now, we could make a sort of a pyramid diagram. So here we put a primary submind at the top, and then we have this layer of subminds, and then under each of them there's a layer of subminds, and so on and so forth. So at the top of this pyramid is just one submind. The lateral expansion at the top level would be to other primary subminds. And likewise, within the next tier is a lateral expansion. But to go down to deeper and deeper tiers is the vertical expansion of the training. So your initial training, it's occurring at a rather superficial level. It's a little bit slippery. You keep losing it. and you work to make it more stable, and then you're progressing through the stages as you master each of these mental capacities, mental abilities that are associated with this, right? How that happens is through this lateral and this vertical expansion. As more and more of the mind system becomes a part of the mind system that has been thoroughly trained, then you achieve a degree of mastery. But let's look at all that we really experience directly is consciousness, the information exchange occurring between some subset of primary subminds. Is everyone following my description so far? Okay. So we experience consciousness. It's an information exchange through a subset of primary subminds. The particular subset that is participating in our conscious experience at any moment is not always the same. Now, if it consists of that set that you've been training daily for weeks or months or years even, then you're going to have a fabulous meditation and you're going to be at a higher stage. To the degree that on a particular day, or even as part of the same sit, there is a shift, and there is now an increasing proportion of subminds that haven't been trained. You're going to be slipping down, have an experience of being at an earlier stage. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. Because the more you practice this way, the larger the subset of primary subminds and of secondary, tertiary, quaternary, etc. subminds are being trained. And this is how you make the real and permanent progress. Right? So this back and forth is not a bad thing. It's a wonderful thing, and it's a necessary thing. Now, life circumstances. The subset of primary subminds that is active when you sit down on the cushion each day is going to be largely determined by the activities that you've been engaged in prior to that. It's going to be affected by the current life circumstances, your fears, your hopes, your joys and aspirations, your worries and concerns, your problems, the lottery you just won for $5,000, all these different things. So you can't expect to sit down every day and have the same subset of subminds enter into the meditation process. Well, that could happen. And there are some less effective meditation techniques that will be very conducive to that happening. So that basically you sit down and these other subminds that are online that haven't been trained, you shut them down by suppressing them, right? This is what happens when overly focused attention and no appreciation and recognition of the sati component, of the awareness component. Things like that. So you're going to be able to sit down every day and have a wonderful meditation experience, but you're going to get up and you're not going to be a very different person as a result of it. Much better that you come to the cushion with a different set of subminds that undergoes the same training and you experience this back and forth movement. Now, the most extreme form of it is one of my students, one of the graduates of my teacher training programs, and who's doing a lot of teaching. He has actually gone through the entire 10 stages intentionally 4 different times, at least last time I spoke to him, and found each time he learned so much more in that progression. By learning so much more, what he meant what I would translate into the sort of paradigm I'm describing it right now is each time he did that, more of the mind system achieved the same level of training corresponding to, by each time he arrived at stage 10, more of the mind system was at stage 10. That stage 10 was a much more stable state. And of course, along the way, came even a deeper understanding of the insights he'd already acquired, which of course was conducive to transition through the higher path. Now, let me speak to insight and path attainments. Exactly the same thing is true of insight and path attainments. When one reaches stream entry, the entire mind system has not fully assimilated all of these insights. You've reached you're a stream entrant because you've achieved a threshold of subminds that have fully assimilated insight to a particular degree of maturity, okay? But a stream entrant has many parts of their mind system that it's everywhere from haven't achieved this particular level of maturity to haven't fully assimilated insights to even those that haven't really achieved any insight at all. One of the ways the stream entry is described is the 7 times returner. And what this means, as I said earlier, 7 is a number that means some, for sure, but not a huge number. And what this is the 7 times of returning to the samsaric state. Okay? Now this is a threshold. No one's ever going to return to being a worldling. They're going to be a stream entrant. But a stream entrant is going to have experiences where the predominant set of subminds that are active are not at the level of stream entry in terms of insight and the maturation of insight. What they will experience subjectively is suffering and engaging in forms of behavior that are harmful to themselves and to others, that are reflections of self-clinging. And of course, this is what gives rise to craving and suffering. This doesn't last long though, because they will experience a reawakening to first path. Some point they'll suddenly, I don't need to suffer like this. I know better. I don't need to be behaving like this. Their suffering will reach a certain intensity that will trigger that recognition. Or the suffering of others around them will suddenly, it's like, wow, I don't need to be doing this to the people around me. I don't need to be doing this to myself. And all of the insights then emerge, and they're back into that state that is described as stream entry, based on the falling away of those 3 fetters. You see? Each time this has happened, it's actually really a good thing for exactly the same reasons that I described with regard to the stages of samatha vipassana. The same thing is true of the higher paths. Progressively more and more of the mind system is reaching progressively higher degrees of maturation of wisdom and dispelling of ignorance. So we don't see this, we don't experience this as a static progression. You reach a certain level and you're never ever going to slip back even a little bit. Okay? But how much you slip back, how often you slip back, and what you slip back to is dramatically changed even at the level of a stream entrant. You may fall back to the samsaric experience of a pre-stream entry worldling, but not to the same degree, and certainly for not very long. You may be well into the experience of second path, where craving is so attenuated that when it arises, you can confront it and you can dispel it through the power of your mindfulness. That doesn't mean that there won't be times where craving arises, and instead of recognizing for what it is, you allow it to begin to take hold of your mind. But that doesn't last for very long. Probably not going to lead you to act out of it, or you're going to catch yourself, right? But it can still happen. And when it does, it's good, because it's a reflection of the parts of your mind that hadn't really quite achieved the level of wisdom to bring about the transformation from first to second path, and so on and so forth. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was fantastic. Yeah, that was really, I mean, I'll probably have to listen to the recorded video again to kind of get it all, but that really answered, I kind of get it. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any questions or comments?
I just had a very small one as a follow-up to that. I just wondered if, because I always do my sit at the same time every day in the morning, from what you're saying with the different subminds, you wanting all the different subminds to sort of get on board, do you recommend switching that up? So doing your practice at different parts of the day, for example, at the end of the working day when you've got a very busy mind, do you recommend changing when you're doing the practice so that you are working with different sets of subminds?
Yes, at some point that becomes a useful thing to do. Or what can be even more useful is to do 2 sits a day. Because you'll have the benefit of your powerful morning sit, and then you'll have your evening sit, which is going to be qualitatively different. And then sitting, and another important part of this is bringing your practice into your daily life, and this also is very conducive to the increasing effectiveness of the training to the whole mind system. But yes, sitting at different times. I also recommend, if you can, whenever you can, set aside a day or the better part of a day to do multiple sits and walks, because this will also give you a lot of forward momentum in this process. So. One of the things, there's this perspective that I'm coming from that you might find helpful to know about. We have, for at least 2,500 years, certainly 2,000 years, 2,500 years, become progressively more and more linear in our thinking, linear, reductionistic, and analytical. There is another way of thinking that's called systems thinking. It's much more holistic. And you can understand, I've introduced you to the mind system as a system. The brain is the most complex system we know of in the entire physical universe. The mind is obviously at least as complex, and it's very useful to describe the mind as a system. What's characteristic of all systems, but especially complex systems, is all systems are open in the sense that there's constantly new information, energy, or depending on the nature of the system, matter coming into the system. And the system is also dispersing as appropriate energy, information, and matter. I mean, the body as a system obviously is doing that. You take in water, food, all these other things, and you excrete them, and in the process, the system maintains itself, grows, develops, etc. Every complex system does that. They're dynamic. They're capable of many different states, and of course, that describes our mind very well. They are self-organizing, which means that what they can do in response to new information and new experience, and this can be internal as well as external, because a complex system is constantly, all of its parts are interacting with each other. So what it can do is cultivate new states and deepen and intensify different states. So this explains a lot of the behavior of our mind. How do we get stuck in negative mind states? How do we cultivate powerfully effective beneficial mind states, positive mind states? It is because the mind is a self-organizing system. In a system, every part is interconnected, and those interconnections take the form of positive and negative feedback loops. And in TMI, I'm, without explicitly identifying it as such, I'm encouraging the meditator to make use of positive and negative feedback loops that naturally arise, to assist in training the interactions of these different parts of the mind system to achieve and to stabilize certain states. So that's really what the meditation process is about. If you'd like to look into this further, the two resources that I would recommend to you, first of all, the one that's easiest of all to read is The System's View of Life by Fritjof Capra, and the name of his co-author slips me at the moment. Now, the other one, which is really powerful, but it is more difficult reading, is by Joanna Macy, and it's called Mutual Causality, General Systems Theory and Mutual Causality in Buddhism. And her book brings this home. If you read The System's View of Life, you'll immediately see all kinds of correlations with the Buddha Dharma as a description, with insight as a description of reality, the interconnectedness of everything, the predominance of process over things, and so on and so forth. But if you read Joanna Macy's book, I mean, reading Systems View of Life, you'll have to make these connections on your own. You read Joanna Macy's book, and she cuts to the quick. She says, this is what Buddhism is all about. So for any of you who would like to step out of just pure meditation and traditional Dharma and to get, well, let me say this. Systems thinking is coming to predominate every aspect of our intellectual world. Physics, biology, I mean, ecosystems, biology is really at the forefront of systems thinking in terms of the natural sciences. Physics is moving that direction. Sociology, anthropology, psychology, politics, history. There is no intellectual discipline in the world that is not starting to be affected by systems thinking. It is a revolutionary paradigm comparable to that took place with the birth of the with the European Enlightenment, Copernicus and Galileo, and then Newton and everything that followed from that. That was a previous huge revolution in thinking. Systems thinking is that next revolution, and we're just right at the beginning of that. So join the future.
Is chaos theory also something that works on system theory?
Chaos theory is very much a part of general systems theory. Well, general systems theory has expanded to include chaos theory and complexity theory. There's a whole number of disciplines. And these, in fact, are all mentioned in that Systems View of Life book. They do make reference to this. You know, the whole, well, climatology is essentially an application of systems theory, and it's and it expresses one of the manifestations of chaos and complexity theory in that metaphor of the butterfly flapping its wings in Hong Kong, producing a thunderstorm in London a few weeks later. You know, small initial conditions can produce very large results.
And I'm guessing mindfulness is also one such butterfly.
Absolutely. Everything about the Dharma is best understood from the point of view of systems theory.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, we've got another question that I didn't answer, but I will now. It's from Nicole, and she isn't here. And she says, I have more experience with awakening within my nighttime dream life versus awakening during my daytime waking life. This is something I'm trying to remedy through the instructions in your books. I cannot help but wonder, though, what are your thoughts on so-called lucid dreaming, dream yoga, and the benefits that can be derived from it? I do personally believe it has its benefits, but I would enjoy your perspective on it. Well, I think these are extremely valuable things, Nicole. And lucid dreaming, very, very valuable. Dream yoga, extremely valuable. They can teach us a lot. They are conducive to insight and to the growth and maturation of insight. Now, going back to your first statement, you're more experienced with awakening within my nighttime dream life versus awakening during my daytime waking life. Now, this is exactly the kind of awakening that this practice is all about. Both a dream and your waking life are a mind-constructed reality. And we live in both of these realities as if they were ultimately real, right? Rather than being mind-constructed. The difference between the two is that the dream reality is much more evidently purely mind-constructed than our waking reality. And I made reference to this earlier, that the state of wakefulness as compared to the dreams is a state in which your construct of reality is far more constrained by your senses, by what you're actually feeling, rather than by your mind's projection of sensory experience that isn't really rooted in something outside of the mind. The experience of lucid dreaming is an exact parallel to what awakening is. It's seeing this waking reality in the same way that you see a dream reality with lucid dreaming. You recognize it for what it is. You no longer mistake it for having some quality of being ultimately real. As a matter of fact, meditators spontaneously experience lucid dreaming very often, very consistently. And it is part of that progression towards um, uh, towards the same kind of lucid construction of an empty reality that we experience in our daily life. Now, I'll point out that our waking life is not only constrained by the laws of the physical universe and therefore constrained by the sensory information through our senses, we are also very much embedded in a consensual reality. Although it's not always as consensual as we may like to believe, it is actually strongly imposed upon us. As children, we are forced into seeing things in the conventional way, in the way everybody else does. And if you see things differently, you're weird. You tend to become an outsider. Right? But it has its benefits as well, but it can be disastrous either way. There is an enormous amount of pressure to conform to the consensual reality in our waking lives. It's through developing these mental faculties that we are allowed to break through that and to have the lucid dreaming experience when we're awake and begin to see that, wow, this is not a world of things in which I am a separate thing and my happiness and unhappiness depends on how well I can manipulate this world of other things. That all begins to fall apart because you can see now this is just like a dream. This is like a fantasy, and it works pretty well, but part of the reason that it works pretty well is just that everybody else is operating on the same basis. So as long as I stay embedded in a social reality, it's going to seem to work really, really good. It's going to get constantly reinforced. Something happens that doesn't fit my reality. It's very easily discounted, explained away, so on and so forth. What happens as we develop the faculties of samatha and vipassana is something happens that doesn't fit the consensual reality, is we now investigate it. We've had all these previous experiences that didn't fit either. Now they start to be put together to form a pattern. Now we're on the way to seeing things in a completely different way, right? And so these things that would one time been dismissed as anomalies instead become powerful insight experiences that can give rise to insight. You know, Leonard Cohen, who is a Zen Buddhist, wrote a song specifically about this. Ring the bells that still can ring. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets through. There are many cracks in this contrived consensual reality that we are a part of. And that's how the light of truth, wisdom, and insight gets through. We just make ourselves much more receptive to them. So let's go on to, there's a second question that Nicole has. Nicole, my other question is, without going into detail, I've had a very difficult past, which I'm working to rise above. I am remarkably well for all that I have been through. I'm finding meditation practice to be soothing and helpful. In the past, I self-medicated with wine and cannabis as a way to cope. and I still sometimes struggle with craving and reaching for those things as an antidote for stress. Is there any particular form of practice you would recommend for someone like me? Well, I want you to know, Nicole, that I empathize entirely with what you are saying, your situation, okay? I had a very difficult past, an extremely traumatic childhood. I left home when I was 15. For 3 years, I lived on the streets, got involved in street gangs and all kinds of things like that. I managed to rise above that. I learned coping mechanisms to deal with the consequences of my childhood trauma that had caused me to leave home and all of those things. I want to say that with regard to trauma, I've recognized that there are two pretty common responses to trauma. One is that we hold on to pain and anger at some level of the mind. We hold on to it and all of its vividness, and it controls us. This leads to various forms of addiction, you know, or substance abuse, or there's actually all kinds of ways that we, very unhealthy ways that we have of trying to manage that that pain and anger that we just don't know how to let go of. The other way, it also doesn't involve the actual healing of the wounds, but we develop coping mechanisms. And we gradually integrate those coping mechanisms into the day-to-day reality of our post-trauma life. Now, and this is the path that I took. Instead of, you know, I could very easily with my past have ended up derelict, dead in an alleyway somewhere of an overdose, or in prison, or all kinds of other things. I didn't, though. You know, I got a Ph.D., I've had a very successful career in life and everything like that. But the problem with how I did that was that those original wounds weren't really healed, and the coping mechanisms remained as an ugly residue, the scars of my trauma. And my life progressed from kind of an open wounded agony to discovering and rediscovering new levels of equilibrium through refining of those coping mechanisms. A very large part of that was that I undertook what I now recognize as a spiritual path. But essentially what I did is, after those years on the streets and seeing what happened to people in that situation, it's like, I didn't want that. I didn't want that life. But I wanted to understand why this world was such a miserable mess, why I and so many others had gone through so much trauma, why there was so much pain and suffering in the world. I'd even come to recognize that the people that seemed to be well off, as a matter of fact, I came from a very comfortable upper middle class family. My father was a research chemist and very esteemed, and you know, we had a lot of, but didn't make my life any less horrible. And my life was due to my father severely damaged by PTSD from World War II. My mother had so many problems and things like that. It was obvious to me that there was something wrong, and I wanted to understand. So this is how it started out, and it became a spiritual seeking. It led me to, you know, one of the things I would do was to hang out in the public library and read. And I'd read philosophy and I'd read science. My father was a scientist and my mother was very brilliant. So yeah, I read science and philosophy. And I decided that I needed to get myself out of that life, and I succeeded. I won't tell you all of the stories. But once I made up my mind, it seems like miracles happened to facilitate that. Years and years later, I found myself, I discovered through therapy that the coping mechanisms that I had developed to overcome my early childhood trauma were also, they had made me successful in life, but they were also inherently unwholesome and unhealthy. And so what I would recommend to you, first of all, not everyone has as much early life trauma as you and I seem to have. Everybody has trauma, though. Everybody bears those scars. There is accumulation of that in life. If your childhood is idyllic, usually your adolescence is far more painful. And that extends into the struggles of early adulthood. And of course, life is going to throw all kinds of things your way. So there is no one who comes to this Dharma and this practice who doesn't have various kinds of trauma, various kinds of unresolved contradictory belief systems that they've assimilated, all kinds of things like that, and they've learned to cope with. The first thing that I would recommend to you is that you learn and understand what I'm referring to when I talk about purifications, because this is something that most meditation approaches tend to disregard, overlook, discount. Instead, I find it extremely important. It is a healing process. But for people who have the kind of trauma that you and I had, and I think this applies to more people than realize, meditation isn't designed to do that. It's not its primary intention. It's just that that kind of healing is an inevitable part of a really successful meditation practice. So understanding that and embracing that allows it to be more effective. It allows you to progress in your meditation and Dharma practice towards insight and awakening much more quickly. So that's why I put the stress on it in TMI. But for people like us, it's going to take therapy. And sometimes it's going to take traumatic life events to make us aware that we still have problems. We've made this enormous spiritual progress. You know, I had achieved tremendous spiritual equilibrium, and then things happened in my life that forced me to look at those coping mechanisms left over from the early part of my life, and to realize that they too had become automatic, completely unconscious. They were totally invisible to me. I'll be specific. I became extremely conflict averse, and I would do anything to avoid conflict. Very, very much acquiescing to, very much placating, very much wanting to assuage in one way or another the causes of somebody else's anger or whatever, you know. I just, you know, avoiding conflict at all costs. Go ahead, knock me down. I've been knocked down many times before. I'll just get up again, right? I'm not going to fight with you. The other thing is that I had never learned to establish appropriate boundaries. Now, intellectually, I understood the idea of boundaries, and I could recognize when other people didn't have good boundaries. But subjectively, I didn't even know what personal boundaries were. And I allowed them to be violated all of the time. Instead, I built a boundary inside, sort of at the emotional level. There was a certain point that it was more than just a boundary. It was more like Trump's fence. It was a steel wall that I never, ever let anybody get beyond. And that was my coping mechanism. Because I couldn't establish external boundaries in my relationships with other people, instead I maintained this internal boundary. And that was not healthy. My failure to establish personal boundaries and my conflict avoidance, both of these things have become invisible to me as habitual behavior patterns. I didn't know I was not capable of establishing boundaries. I just behaved in the way that I had learned to, that allowed me to be successful in my interactions with other people. I didn't realize, well, I knew that I hated conflict, but hey, conflict's a bad thing anyway, isn't it? It just seemed really nice and a really good way to be. Well, actually, it's not. I've since discovered conflict is sometimes necessary. It's desirable. It just needs to happen in the right way. It's learning when conflict is appropriate and conducting oneself in a conflict situation in a healthy and wise way. I'm in the process of learning that. When I learned that I had these problems, I said, my God, I have a lifetime of conditioning. At my age, I'll never be able to overcome those. But once I had recognized and understood them, I was amazed by how easily it was, starting in easy ways, for me to set boundaries. I could set boundaries with salespeople. I could set boundaries with neighbors, as to what I would find acceptable and not. I've been getting better and better at setting boundaries. Conflict, I still hate conflict, but now I'm able, at least in some situations, to recognize that this is not a time to let somebody walk over me. This is a time to make a stand, to be gentle, to be understanding, to be compassionate. But I don't need to budge. I can make my stand, So that was the result of therapy. So Nicole and all of you, should you discover, and the way you will discover this is most probably the way I did, life will bring it to your attention. You will think you're doing so well on your spiritual path until you realize something didn't work. Oh my God, there is a disaster unfolding in front of me. And where did that come from? So it was through therapy that I recognized these things, and it made a powerful difference for me. So Nicole, from the point of view of formal practice, take maximal advantage, recognizing and understanding that things that arise in meditation of an emotional nature are important. When memories, unpleasant memories, when anything arises that is in some way disturbing, especially in meditation, it's important. It means something. It arose in meditation because it had an opportunity to come to the surface. Don't neglect that. Learn how to deal with these things to bring about a purification. If you find that you can't do that, if you can't achieve a resolution and integration of these past problems in meditation, don't hesitate to find somebody that you can really work with, you know, to help you with them. So, yeah, so thank you for that question, Nicole. And it's too bad you couldn't be here, but I know you'll listen to the recording and maybe you'll be able to join us next time. Anybody have anything just before we terminate this session that you?
I have a little question. Is that okay? Does anyone else have anything? Is that good? Yeah, so it's the kind of thing where I know that there's a question there, but it's not fully formed. So I'll just speak a bit about my average practice, and I think it'll come out if that's okay. So I seem to be, depending on the day, 7, 8, 9, I think. So my average sit is that I do the whole go through the stages, and it gets to the point where it feels more stable. It feels like there's just a natural intuition that I can let go now.
Yes.
What I notice there, and the joy sort of arises, what I notice there is that I get a lot of satisfaction by just completely letting go and taking the whole sort of mind, all the kind of arising and passing as an object in itself, rather I just completely let it go and just observe, just sit back and observe. And then every now and again, when anything arises, noting that it contains suffering, that it's changing, that it's not me because I'm witnessing it, which has started to develop a deepening insight, which is really, really nice. What I'm noticing though is that I know in the Mind Illuminated, there's often it speaks about going back to the nose of the breath and going deeper, and you can get cessation experiences even from going there. But I'm noticing within me a sort of a reluctancy to even go to the breath of the nose at all. It feels like I really want to stay in this expansive state. And I guess my question is it necessary? Is it just the case that it's a season of practice, that I'm just exploring this, and there'll probably come a time when it feels more natural to go back?
Oh, this is quite normal. One of the things if you go back and look at stage 8, one of the things that I say there right at the beginning is you've reached a point now where it's no longer necessary to fix your attention on a single object for extended periods of time. It can be very useful, and when it's useful, you do so. But what you have developed the skill and ability to do, and what the different practices in stage 8 allow you to learn how to do, is that you can have this quality of stable insight, or stable attention with that penetrating vipassana quality. It can be just as stable, just as powerful, just as penetrating, landing on a series of objects one after another, as it is on a single object for a prolonged period of time. That's the wonder of the attention in this samadhi vipassana state. That's what it is. The samadhi, as a matter of fact, originally the idea of samadhi incorporated vipassana, and then somehow they got separated from each other. So it was actually late in the Buddha's teaching that he first introduced the distinction of vipassana, right? And that was because he was encountering students who were developing stability of attention in a way that they didn't develop Vipassana. And the advice he gave them is, so you develop samatha in terms of stability attention, but you don't have Vipassana. Well, go find somebody to go learn Vipassana. But also the counterpart was that is if you learn Vipassana and you don't have the samadhi, you don't have the stability of attention, he referred to it as samatha, then you need to go and get that component. You have both of those at stage 8. And so you can use both. There's no longer any necessity for going back to the nose and essentially parking your attention on the sensations of the breath, unless it is for a specific purpose, either to further expand and explore from the vantage point of sati, of awareness, of metacognitive introspective awareness, or in order to penetrate more deeply into a single sensory phenomenon and the mind's processing of that phenomenon. You see, by focusing on the sensations of the breath from a stage 8 or 9 perspective, actually, I give these practices in stage 7, but this can, by just taking, okay, I'm going to take the laboratory of the sensations of the breath, and I'm going to explore how my mind processes information. And I'm going to be in this Vipassana state of seeing what's really there. This will give rise to the recognition of impermanence, emptiness, very much of emptiness. You see the mind-created nature of the sensory experience of the breath, things like that. So it can be useful. So don't throw it out the window, but it's no longer necessary. It's just one of the many ways you can use attention. Okay?
I had a follow-up question just then, but then I lost it. Never mind. Thank you very much. That's really, that's good to know.
It occurs to me, just give you one caveat, is that you want to use that joy, that wonderful good feeling that you have as positive feedback to recruit more and more of your mind to develop these same capacities and to participate in this state that you're in. But you don't want to cling to it. So just be careful of the tendency to want to cling to this beautiful, blissful, wonderful state, or the energy and clarity that's associated with it. It's that subtle thing of accepting them, even taking them as a gift to be appreciated, but not attempting to cling to them. So if your resistance to going back to the breath is, oh, I don't want to let go of this, then moderate that. See if you can get to the clinging part and just let go of it and say, okay, I can go back to the breath anytime it makes sense. And it's just fine.
Similar, I think there's this thing where I notice that it's useful to go to the breath again if I notice any sort of dullness arise or any distractions start to arise. And so I used to go back to the breath to do that, and then when it was more stable again, go out. Mm-hmm. But I think in recent sits, I've started to notice that it's been interesting to just observe the system become less unified and more unified, and observe that process as well.
Yes.
I noticed that I found that, yes, I could go and I could reduce this dullness, mm-hmm. but actually there's something really interesting about seeing that even shamatha passing is something that can be witnessed, which is why I think the reluctancy is there, because it's like it's almost like there's an insight there that's really, really interesting to see that even just I'm not even part of this unification, even that's just its own thing. So yeah, I guess I've been so trained from like stages 5 and 6 that, you know, dullness is something to overcome, that I guess I wanted to bring it to you, because I was like, is that always the case, or actually can you just allow these things to arise and pass and just try and witness them from that Vipassana perspective?
Yes, you can allow them to arise and pass and observe them in order to learn from them. Where does this dullness come from? Why is it arising? What is my mind trying to achieve? Is it avoiding something? Is it clinging to something? What's all behind this? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for this call. Thank you.
You're most welcome. Okay, well, I'll let you all go. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening, as the case may be. And thank you for joining me today. And I hope you'll all be able to join me again in 2 weeks. Otherwise, you'll have the recordings. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank
Culadasa.
you.
Best wishes to all of you. Yeah.
Thank you.